Hello, everyone out there on Facebook Live, as well as on Spreaker.com, KEVOLE, SoundCloud.com, KEVOLE, YouTube, subscribe on YouTube, Kevin Olenek, subscribe on iTunes, agree or disagree with the podcast. We are talking today, you may have stood a little bit earlier, but today has been focused on Calgary 2026, and of course, City Council in Calgary voted 12-3 to continue with the plebiscite on the middle of November to decide whether or not to go for the bid for the Winter Olympics in Calgary. And we heard from the Yes side earlier today. Jason Riberio from Yes Calgary joined us, and you can check that podcast out. I will put that in the comments a little bit if you have missed it. But to be fair, there's also a side of people, and it's even something that Jason has acknowledged, is there are some people that have some concerns, some questions about this bid. And when you say a bid is going to cost, you can have a party. You can have a really huge party with a whole bunch of people and it can get really exciting. You can really buy a new purchase of something. But when that price tag comes up and you hear the number $5 billion, it jolts us a little bit. And there has been a number of questions and concerns raised about where this bid is going. And to talk a little bit from that perspective and perhaps bring us to light as we go forward, and not only in Calgary, but here in Kamloops, questions I think need to be asked and answered. Jenna is Trevor Tombe via Skype. Trevor is, of course, does a number of different things. My information is not put up here. He says he knows nothing about most things and a little about some. Associate professor at Econ Calgary's research fellow as well. Trevor, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you. I want to start by playing the end of what Jason talked about on our podcast and kind of get from there, because he expressed a little bit of concern from looking at this from a purely economic point of view. So I'm just going to play this first, and then we'll go from there.
And in terms of Trevor Tombe, I think you'll have a great conversation with him tonight. I do think that, the job of academics and myself as a PhD student and managing my community responsibilities is to often poke holes in things. I think he's a great voice in addition to the discourse in Calgary and in Alberta. I do wonder sometimes about the economic analysis impacts versus the actual pragmatic financial implications of making a decision like this and the benefits, because certain economists and certain models won't attribute specific benefits, depending on where they are in the spectrum in the academic world, to particular interventions like infrastructure that wouldn't be afforded or dollars that wouldn't have been leveraged through a bid. They don't predict in that way. So I think it should be taken with a grain of salt, but I'm happy that you're talking to him, and I'm happy that he's contributing to this discussion.
Awesome. What say you to that? What are your... Is there a concern that some of the opposition to this has been purely economic and not necessarily pragmatic, or what are you seeing on that?
So I think there's two broad things to interpret from what Jason said there, and we want to keep them separate. One is the question of the economic implications of the Olympics, and not just the Olympics, but other large-scale mega projects of this type. Issues around, does it increase GDP, does it increase employment, what's the effect on wages, and so on. And then a second separate issue is, do the Olympics enable Calgary to extract more financial resources from higher levels of government than it otherwise could? So, for example, large-scale infrastructure like Green Line in Calgary, that cost is typically split 1/3 federal, 1/3 provincial, 1/3 municipal. Whereas the Olympic cost split is going to be 50% federal, and we're still waiting to hear some details before the public, but it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 15/35 or 20/30 or something like that. So the Olympics as an event is indeed a way for Calgary to extract more resources, financial resources, from higher levels of government. And there's no way around that. It's because the federal contribution is a higher share than what we typically see for infrastructure projects. So to be clear, when we talk about economic benefits, whose benefits are we talking about? Are we talking about just Calgary? Are we talking about Alberta as a province, or from the perspective of Canada as a whole? And these each very different answers. And because the Olympics is a national event paid for half of it by Canadian taxpayers across the countries, we ought to think a little bit more broadly than just the perspective of Calgary. But I wouldn't argue with Jason that the Olympics are a way to lever some more dollars from higher levels of government. Whether or not it's a good public policy case that different cities are trying to get international large-scale events in order just to get federal dollars. I think that leads to a dangerous place, competition between cities just to bid on things, even if the value of themselves is perhaps so lower than otherwise. So let's put that into one. And the second separate question is the overall economic fit in terms of employment and GDP. And that's separate. We looked at games in the past to ask, what happened to cities that hosted those games in terms of their employment. And Vancouver, for example, you look at employment before, during, and after the games compared to elsewhere in the country, and you see no deviation from that. So Vancouver had no measurable increase in employment as a result of Vancouver 2010. So that's not at all expected. Any reasonable model right now is going to make that prediction because there are only so many words to go around. So an increase in spending on the games is going to reallocate activity from one sector to another, from one location to another, rather than increase total number of jobs available in this. So I want to separate the discussion. One, are we comfortable using the Olympics as a tool to extract dollars from the feds? Or are we viewing the Olympics as a way to increase economic activity? Say the first claim is a reasonable claim to make. Second, quite a bit less so.
Okay. So I think the way that I'd like to approach this is sort of the Canadian sandwich way, which is what's good, what's missing, and what could be improved. So what is, in your mind, some of the economic benefits that you're seeing from this bid?
So let's first look at the claimed economic benefits are. So in the bid corporation's presentation to City Council now just a couple of days ago, they outlined $7.4 billion worth of economic benefits from hosting the games. And I guess I would take issue with that number in a number of different ways. First, the $1.5 billion of federal spending on the games is not itself entirely an economic benefit to Alberta. A lot of that spending will be in form of compensation for soldiers, for RCMP officers, for equipment, vehicles and planes and so on. And those are payments that don't accrue to Albertans. I mean, these are soldiers, officers coming in from all over the country. So that's not strictly speaking an economic benefit to Alberta. And then there's the assets themselves. We could point to the venues, the housing, the facilities that the Olympics would build. A lot of those would be built regardless. Certainly they would be built with slightly higher contribution from the municipal government relative to the other two, but they're assets that would very likely be built anyway. So when thinking about the economic benefit of the games, we have to think about what's the incremental effect of the games. What would the world look like if we didn't bid compared to the world where we did? And claim that all the activity from the games wouldn't happen otherwise is certainly false and leads to high numbers. And then the second point, with that $7.4 billion in benefits, the BidCo points to the economy growing in Alberta by $2 billion. And it gets that number by running the model in the background where it feeds in spending associated with the games, and the model spits out a predicted effect on things like GDP and employment. But those models tend to not account for where the spending came from. Dollars spent by the Alberta government or the Canadian government or Calgary municipal government on activities associated with the games are probably dollars that would have been spent elsewhere. So again, it's a shift of economic activity rather than an increase in the total. So I think the right way to think about the games is not in terms of economic benefits. There's not a strong case, certainly historically. All the analysis today doesn't suggest that there's a big kind of stimulus effect of the games. We should look at them as something that might increase civic pride, community engagement, promotion of sports, national pride, the Canadian and Calgary brand, promoting that internationally, and then we should ask, are the costs worth paying? We definitely shouldn't be under the impression that there are no costs, and to claim economic benefits that exceed the costs of the games, essentially to say that the games are a flush, which is, I think, quite overstated.
Right. So you're basically saying, right now it's more civic, but in terms of economics, you're not seeing this. Vancouver 2010 didn't really see that in terms of labor.
Right.
Although there has been the argument presented by some of the people from Vancouver, things like the Canada line wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the Olympics. So is there a possibility that we could see some unforeseen economic benefits for bringing back 2026?
So that's an interesting point. Vancouver 2010 had three major peripheral infrastructure projects associated with the games: the Canada Line, the Sea Sky Highway, and a brand new convention center. With the Calgary 2026 games, the BidCo put forward involved no additional peripheral infrastructure projects. So I think we ought to think about those line items on their own merits. If an LRT to the airport passes a reasonable cost-benefit test, then we ought to be advocating for spending that area, whether we host the games or not. And there's been some recent innovations federally that might make it plausible for us to think we could compete for federal dollars for projects like that, and that's setting up the new Canada Infrastructure Bank. This is meant to increase the amount of funding available for infrastructure projects that are revenue generating. such as public transit or toll roads or things where there are fees associated with it, transmission lines, things of that nature. It's still getting going, so we'll see whether or not that new infrastructure bank does increase the amount of funding available. But we shouldn't think that if a project makes sense, that it won't get funding. Certain politics being what it is, some projects that make sense don't get funding, but that's, I don't think, a convincing argument for bidding on the games, kind of short-circuit the pre-existing decision-making process. If there's a problem with how we're allocating infrastructure dollars, then let's fix that.
Okay. So what are your concerns with this bid? Some public perception has been that the fact that there's a 6,000-seat arena, but not a big arena. Field house is in it. Jason argued that the field house was going to be part of this, that we need a field house, that is fact. McMahon Stadium being renovated. There's some people that feel that the Stampeders need a new stadium and the LRT part. Maybe what are some of your economic concerns that you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I guess I want to be careful getting too far out of my wheelhouse.
Sure.
The Olympics or any mega project of this scale involves so many considerations and so many issues that I'm just not well informed about. So I know these economic impact studies are done, so I want to look back to that second. But
sure.
I don't have a lot of concerns or what the bid corporation put forward. I certainly don't know whether or not construction costs of this venue or that are reasonable or not, or whether or not the $610 million security is too small, or whether or not the $5.2 billion in overall cost is understated. Certainly, every Olympics since the 1960s has seen cost overruns. So if I were to bet, I'd say that the costs are going to go higher than the 5.2 that was initially quoted here, which is itself higher than the earlier 4.6, I believe, estimate put forward council initially. So those are just generic concerns, and those are concerns that I guess we should all have for any kind of large-scale infrastructure project. If you're going to be spending billions of dollars on massive infrastructure, then cost overruns are not a surprise there. My concern with what the bid corporation forward is strictly about economic impact numbers that it put out. It's claiming $7.4 billion in economic gains, and many components behind that number are faulty. So I worry about putting out information that misleads voters support the games in a way that isn't actually going to pan out. So I mentioned the $1.5 billion doesn't accrue to Alberta in its entirety. The GDP numbers inflated because they're not accounting for displacement effects, like shifting public spending from other areas to games. In fact, some of the venues and assets would be spent otherwise. And these are not concerns that I uniquely share. These are concerns the city has already received feedback on in the initial exploration phase. Prior to the bid corporation even coming about, we had the Calgary Bid Exploration Committee. And it put forward some analysis. It produced, or I should say, contracted for some economic impact studies for Deloitte and the conference board. And then the city, to their great credit, sought out some reviews, some kind of referee report or peer reviews of the conference board and Deloitte report. So I wrote one of those, and another independent economist in the United States wrote another that were pretty highly critical of the methods used to quantify the economic benefits games. So I hope that the bid corporation incorporates a lot of those critiques to come out with either a more credible estimate, but I'd say ideally they shouldn't be trying to come up with any kind of economic impact analysis number of any kind. They should just be honest about costs. And then we can each decide for ourselves whether or not the engagement, promotion of sports, community pride, and so on is worth the costs. And reasonable people can disagree on kind of subjective evaluation of the games. But so I think it's a little unfortunate for us to be thinking so much about the economic impacts and the $7.4 billion number, because that, I think, is too much boosterism behind the games and will lead us to, I think, vote in a way that's not based entirely on evidence.
Right. Now, one of the other concerns that came out has been, and there was a big discussion on News 570 between Rob Breckenridge and Stephen Carter about whether or not this will be on budget, because there hasn't been an Olympics that has ever matched the budget. It's always gone over budget. What are your thoughts on that? Is because it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, but there's a perception that from the Yes side that they're feeling like that they can do this under budget. Are they being too bold? Are they missing something? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a tough question, because whether something has gone over budget or not depends on what you're considering the baseline to be. The $2 billion in cost estimates in the draft plan itself is already $500 million more than the number that was first quoted to council when it put together the exploration committee. that 5.2 is also not the final number. At some point, there's going to be the final bid put into the IOC that will contain a number, and it might differ from 5.2. So a reasonable person could say we've already gone above what was initially projected, but given the 5.2 billion is a number that we'll be voting on in the referendum, and this is kind of that benchmark number, I think, that we should consider going forward. To their credit, the big corporation put in a lot of contingencies. There's $430 million in just generic contingencies, and every single one of the venues has itself a great deal of buffer built into it. I believe they have a little over 1.1 billion in contingencies between now and 2026 built into their plan, and so it's a large share of the total spend. So I'd say that's encouraging and quite prudent, and hopefully that would mean they don't go over budget. But keep in mind, the big corporate numbers only include, right now, 2 out of the 3 broad buckets of Olympic spending. So the 3 are the operations of the games themselves, the actual salary of the event staff and so on. Then it's the cost of building the new venues and the athletes' village and housing and things like that. But the third bucket that we don't have any information on or details are what are the peripheral infrastructure projects that are planned in terms of new road construction or public transportation systems and so on. So unless we're not going to see any of that peripheral infrastructure, which would be, I think, precedented, then only that situation would equal we stay within 5.2. For perspective, Vancouver was 7.7 back in 2010, including all the 3 buckets.
So reasonable to expect it to be around that much for Calgary 2026 then, in your mind?
So that's tough. It's hard to compare Vancouver with Calgary. So wages are much higher in Alberta than in British Columbia. So there's going to be some additional costs that we face as building things and operating things in Alberta costs more because we earn more. And that's, of course, a very nice side effect of having a private sector, even now, in oil and gas. So that adds to costs in a way that Vancouver didn't see. And on security, so that's a big line item. That's perhaps the majority of federal spending. That was the majority of federal spending in Vancouver. Nearly half of federal spending that we expect for Calgary. Those costs might rise too, but Vancouver had to involve the Navy. That's no cheap thing to involve, so that's a cost that we can avoid here. But how it all shakes out, I think that's kind of yet to be determined.
So when as we go forward here, and there's these events and the Yes side is presenting their presentation, what would be some of the questions that you would recommend the public ask the Yes side to get some more information out of making a fair decision here? If you're walking with Trevor Tombe, what would be some of the questions you're hoping are being asked here?
So one important question, I think, or I guess let me back up. We still haven't heard a lot of details around how the province is going to approach its contribution. And that's going to be no small thing. So I think one thing to keep in mind is what are the safeguards in place in the event of cost overruns to spread those costs? Who bears the cost overruns? Will it be the City of Calgary, Province of Alberta, federal government? So who's kind of that ultimate backstop here? Because we've seen with Olympics in the past, sometimes unexpected and particularly large cost overruns, even in Canada. So Montreal, for example, had some pretty outstanding cost overruns there. Who's going to be the one that picks that tab? What are the safeguards in place? And this is a question that we should be thinking about for any kind of large-scale infrastructure project, not just the Olympics. If you build a new bridge, sometimes governments will contract with a private sector firm, and they will contract in such a way that cost overruns are borne by the private sector firm to build in some guarantees. And so I think we ought to be thinking about those measures as well. So what are the risk guarantees? But then the second question is going to be that if during promotion of the games, we hear numbers around the economic impact of the games, then we ought to ask where they came from. If they came from methods like the Deloitte study, like the Conference Board study, then they should be dismissed out of hand. And the city in particular, and the bid corporation, and all Calgarians can log on to the city website, read the reasons why the Deloitte and Conference Board studies are dramatically overstated. We should be asking them, like, what are the methods behind those numbers? That's kind of wonky, so I don't imagine actually anyone asks those questions. But we should approach economic impact numbers with a very high degree of skepticism. So going back to the statement that Jason made earlier, it's tough to come up with these numbers, absolutely. And part of what I do is poke holes in those estimates. We should be skeptical when someone's quoting an economic impact number. I think the best way for us to approach this question is to ask the costs worth the non-economic benefits of hosting the games.
Fair. you're giving me a lot to chew on there for a little bit. By the way, for those that are on with live, thank you for joining us here. If you do have questions, hit comment below. We'll get to those as well. I guess, to me, like, where, if you have this information that is, like, you're saying it needs to be somewhat technical, where are we going to get this information that can challenge us? Where else can we look for information to say, wait, what about these numbers? What you're saying?
So on the City of Calgary Olympic website, so I guess I'm not exactly sure what the address is, but the City of Calgary Olympic has posted on it a special page for a potential bid for the 2026 Games that includes the initial exploration committee report. It includes the economic impact analyses put forward by Deloitte and the conference board, and it includes, again, to the city's great credit, external independent reviews and evaluations of those reports. So if you Google City of Calgary Olympic bid exploration reports, there's a page on calgary.ca that includes all of those PDFs. And yeah, it's a little bit of light-time reading, I suppose, but getting the review document read would be a sense of what shortcomings are for these economic impact studies. And if I could just, highlight some of the more intuitive aspects of the report. For the Olympics, if we wanted to think about the economic impact of any spending initiative, any kind of infrastructure investment, or any kind of event or sector, we need a model. We need to, in a computer, model the Canadian economy, the Alberta economy, and then we feed in the spending activity from that. And this is necessarily what we have to do because the Olympics haven't happened yet, so we have to make a prediction with that model. But the devil's really in the details of how those models are designed, and they tend to never ask the question, where did the dollars come from? The dollars are manna from heaven in those models. And it's impossible for GDP to do anything but grow. It's impossible for employment to do anything but grow. But once you feed into those models constraints on the fact that government dollars have to come somewhere, either lower spending in other areas or higher taxes in other areas, then the gains will drop to zero. That also happens when you incorporate the fact that there's only so many workers to go around. Employment can't go above the number of workers that are available. Now, here we are in Calgary. Right now, there's certainly a higher level of unemployment than there tends to be. So we would naturally think that the increased employment would actually come at the cost of other sectors because we would be reducing unemployment. But by early part of the 2010s, when construction really gets going, we're surely going to be averted from the recession that ended in October of 2016. So we shouldn't be saying longer-run investment decisions based on the hope it's going to alleviate unemployment that we see today. So in the long run, employment does tend towards its natural level. Wages adjust, workers move, they retrain, they adjust, and that's how you should be thinking about the games. But certainly, and I guess as a side note, a lot of countries and a lot of consultants produce these kind of economic impact numbers. So StatsCan will just do it for you. You pay them a little bit, you give them information about their spending, and they will spit up for you some GDP and employment prediction. Countries like Australia notably have stopped doing that. They no longer provide any kind of information that will allow you to do an economic impact analysis. They've deliberately chosen to do that because they are misused a lot, not just for the Olympics, but almost every single sector that has a lobbying or industry association has numbers like this. The oil and gas sector, so CAP, will tell you their GDP effect is X, and their job effect is Y. Those all come from input-output models. The dairy sector, now you see a lot of it with the NAFTA negotiations, saying that their economic impact is X. Manufacturers and auto manufacturers do this a lot. But they're not credible, and no academic economist does them anymore. It would be impossible to publish them. And the reason is they're just demonstrably flawed. They're still used because they're easy. You can implement them in Excel. It is literally no more difficult than that. And they were created
You haven't
back
seen me
in...
use Excel, by the way.
Oh, sorry?
You haven't seen me use Excel.
Fair enough. But the models, I don't want to round them too much. They are useful. We still teach them here. I teach them for the Masters of Public Policy students and the Masters students here in economics. They're useful tools when used appropriately. They're good for accounting exercises trying to track dollar flows, but they're not very good at making these predictions for large-scale events as they neglect all of the constraints on employment and government budgets. They were started prior to World War II and really took off during the war because it gave government, prior to the existence of powerful computers, a way to organize war production. Yeah. You could ask, I need a tank. How much metal do I need? How much rubber do I need? How many of this and other input do I need? These models were a very useful tool, and their simplicity was a feature at the time because it allowed you to get close to good numbers with a computer. But nowadays, there's almost no excuse. But you see them used in consulting firms all the time because they're easy, so therefore the profit margin is pretty high for companies that do it.
Now, a number of things I want to get to the IOC question of this a second. You did bring up the provincial government a little while ago. I do want to bring this part of that up because Jason mentioned that both from Notley and Kenny's perspective that they've kind of said if they will go with whatever the plebiscite is. Do you foresee that if the government changes, that the approach to what the funding is to the Olympics changes? Do you see that Notley and Kenny the NDP or the UCP will do something different, or do you see them saying?
Well, far be it from me to make political predictions. I mean, I'm pretty bad at politics or reading what the political situation is for sure. But both main parties have notably not taken a firm position one way or the other. And Calgary is likely to be a battleground in the next election. And so if it turns out that a visible, large majority of Calgarians are in favor of it, then wouldn't be surprised for politicians in all parties to get behind it as well. I mean, that's the nature of politics, of course. What I am interested in, more than whether or not governments support it or not, is how will the provincial government plan to fund it? We're in a pretty difficult budget situation in Alberta right now. I mean, that's no surprise. And it's going to be a particularly salient issue in the campaign. How do we address the deficit? Earlier this year, the government produced a budget that featured a very large and persistent reduction in its planned infrastructure spending. So last year, for perspective, the government spent over $9 billion on investment projects throughout Alberta. This year, they plan to spend less than $6.5 billion. Next year, they plan to spend less than $6 billion. And the year after that, again, $6 billion. And that's a big drop in capital spending. And it's a big drop for the NDP government relative to what they were planning to spend on infrastructure. So if we're going to tackle the deficit and we're going to do it in a way that constrains infrastructure spending, then it's hard to avoid sacrificing other capital projects for the games. And there's a large list of unfunded capital projects that the government releases, that the city releases every year. So we do need to have a hard-headed conversation, I think, whether or not increased highway funding, new school construction. There is still a large list, a long list of unfunded school construction projects on the government books right now. And so we're going to be taking these scarce provincial budget dollars and allocating them to sports venues. I guess that concerns me personally, although, of course, reasonable people can disagree, but we should accept there's an opportunity cost of the publics, and that's not funding other things.
One of the other things that I think is a bit of concern, we haven't clarified where specifically Edgerly venue has been. There is talk it's going to be Edmonton. That's not necessarily factually correct, but we know that there is going to be events in Whistler. What are your thoughts on the fact of this planned kind of Olympic? Is there an economic benefit for you or an economic concern for you in that? And what are your thoughts on the economics of that?
Yeah, I guess I'll leave that to the planners and the engineers to figure it out. But in principle, you face this trade-off. If you locate venues in different locations, then you'll face slightly higher operating costs because you'll be ferrying people between those locations. But you might save on the construction costs. So if it's possible to take advantage of facilities that are located elsewhere, and the savings in terms of the construction costs on that side are large enough to justify the increased operating costs, then that seems entirely sensible. Yeah. And that would be for the plans to figure out, and I'm happy to trust that that's their goal.
Now, the other part of this, and there is some big question about the ethics of the IOC and their funding and their funding model and what their economic platform, their economic perspective is. Can you talk a little bit about what your questions, if you were to sit down with the IOC, what are some of the questions we should be asking about them? I mean, Ryan Pinder on Sportsnet 960 asked a ton of questions about the ethics of what the IOC is going to bring, what the IOC is going to pay the city out, all of those sort of things. From that perspective, what are your concerns? What are your questions around that?
So the IOC contribution, important question, and we got some details around that a few days ago. So the IOC contributes dollars and contributes in-kind contributions. It contributes services, for example. So that lowers costs for the local organizing committee here. And I remember correctly, it was $100 million that the Calgary Bid Corporation is anticipating to come from the IOC. The question, though, is what's the IOC revenue on its side of things? So the international broadcast rights are to the IOC, and then it shares some of that with the local organizing committee. So, for example, Vancouver and London, so Vancouver 2010 and London 2012, were in the same 2009-2012 IOC funding cycle. And the IOC, with international sponsors and broadcast rights, earned $3.2 billion US. It contributed to Vancouver just shy of $600 million. And it contributed to London just a little over $1 billion. So the IOC is keeping a large share, at least historically, of what it earned from the broadcast rights. So I think the IOC has gone some way to increase the contributions financially that it plans to make to future cities. We're almost surely in line for more dollars than what Vancouver 2010 saw, for example. But it still may be the case that the IOC is earning a substantial amount in its own right from broadcast rights. And maybe a more appropriate way to approach this would be for them to split a share of the broadcast rights, which are a substantial $3.2 billion. So combining London plus Vancouver earnings is half of what the IOC earned. And what they did, the other $1.6 billion, I think people have concerns around the IOC operations for sure. So I think we should be looking less for increased dollar contributions and more for a bigger piece of the broadcast pie. That's where a lot of money is located.
Jason, I'll talk a little bit about, there's some people saying we move this to 2030. Is this something that you think, like, is it for you, we just need to look at the economic benefits of this works, either we do it or we don't, or do we need to look at it for a different year?
Yeah, or I guess I would amend that. I wouldn't characterize my position as us looking to economic benefits. So I will firmly plant my flag here as saying the economic benefits are small. So small that we should forget about. The question is, are the Olympics as an event, national pride, promotional sports, and so on, worth the costs? And personally, I'm kind of on the fence. I think the Olympics are amazing. I'm thinking about it. Sure. We shouldn't be basing our decision on whether we host the games or not because the economic benefits are large. They're demonstrably not. Both empirically, if we look at past cities, and in all reasonable models that we can write down. So I just want to make a decision that's clear, based on the evidence and not based on exaggerated claims about the economic benefits, which I think unfortunately preys on our current situation just coming out of recession. I mean, the economy has not been as strong as many people would like, and there's many Albertans who are in difficult situations, and to hang this out there as a way to boost the economy is very misleading. So that concerns me. So that aside, 2030 and 2026, I don't see what's different about them. If you think the games are worth the cost, then they're worth the cost in 2026 or in 2030. If you don't think they're worth cost in 2026, why would it change by 2030? I think that was actually one of the very points that Jason made in your conversation with him. I think that's exactly right, and that's fair enough. If one doesn't feel that the Olympics are worth the costs, great. But 2030 isn't changing.
What about the public perception of this? Because I have noticed from where I'm sitting, and I'm sitting in Kamloops, I feel like from the social media perspective, I'm getting a lot of no and negative to this. There's a lot of concern from this. What are you seeing? I know you're very active on social media as well. Where you kind of get a sense of where the public is at the point with this?
So you definitely don't want to draw too much inference from what you see on social media to what the broader public concern is going to be, or we're all screwed if the general public thinks the weird is.
Twitter's not mine now?
I'm going to agree. So I like Twitter. I mean, I think it's a lot of fun. The very intense engagement is addictive, for sure. The no side here does seem to be angry, if I can put it that way. And that's unfortunate. I think this is a reasonable debate that we can be having. And community-minded individuals can both support or oppose for different reasons because they have different weights on things. Maybe community spirit and promotion of sports means a lot to some people. Maybe others feel that the dollars could be better spent on alleviating inequality or providing even more social housing support than what we would ever see in the games. And that's a reasonable discussion. But I think often I see the no side as being hyper-partisan. And I guess I see generally in Alberta where there's a very vocal group that is angry because we did go through a deep recession, and so there's going to be a lot of strong feelings just on that. But anger towards the government in ways that I think misplaced often. The carbon tax feeds that anger. The municipal election here in Calgary was particularly intense. I mean, I'm not sure it is the Benji, but he does seem to generate a lot of opposition among some individuals. So I think the quality of the debate could be quite a bit higher. On the yes side, I don't see as much anger, of course. I do see a willingness to accept exaggerated claims that support their perspective on the economic benefits in particular. So the truth on this and where a productive debate is best had is going to be somewhere in the middle. I think where we recognize the pros and cons of it, and different people can weigh them different ways, but we should all be able to have a conversation about pros and cons and see where we're coming from. And that's the thing right now.
Yeah. So to be clear, not directly you're opposed, but you're not on the no committee or whatever this no Calgary tier or
I am not involved on any side. I want to make that perfectly clear. And personally, I even say I'm opposed. I think my gut is probably not to bid because I would place a higher weight on addressing our provincial budget situation, which the Olympics would tend to worsen slightly. But except that reasonable people will disagree there. All my concern is that the economic implications of hosting games are top of mind for many individuals. And we're not getting a lot of good quality information on that side. And I think the big corporation, at least in what they released to council a couple of days ago, misleads and distorts the debate. And I think that's unfortunate. So I guess I'm advocating for a debate based on clear, robust, vigorous analysis and not boosterism and not anger.
That's very fair. Is there any part of this conversation that you feel that we haven't been touched yet that you want to bring up? Is there anything that people are maybe missing on, or something that's kind of went under the radar at this point? Or
so it's not something that's under the radar, but I think the most important piece of this puzzle is something that we haven't heard yet at all, and that's the provincial government. What's the amount that they're prepared to contribute? And how do they plan to fund that contribution? That's going to be very important, both in terms of how the government balances the budget pressures, the other infrastructure pressures with the games, and it's going to be very important for the city. So I mentioned way at the beginning of our conversation, the primary motivation for a lot of Olympic supporters is it allows the city to build infrastructure in a way that costs the city less because the feds will kick in more. But if province doesn't kick in a majority of what's left, then the share that the city contributes won't be all that much more than what it would for any normal one-third infrastructure project. And the ball on that is entirely in the provincial government court. There's nothing that city council can do, and the province has committed to releasing details of its planned contributions 30 days before Calgarians vote on questions. So we should stay tuned, but that's going to be a really big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, so waiting to mid-October that should be around mid-October, 30 days, since the vote is November the 13th.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. If there's any questions on Facebook, we'll leave it here at this point. Trevor, how do people follow you on Twitter, or how can people find you? Do they have any questions for you on this?
So I'm on Twitter at Trevor Tombe, so Trevor, the usual way, and then Tomb. And because I'm a professor at the university, I use Google and have some websites with contact information there through the University of Calgary.
Cool. And of course, for those watching on Facebook Live, you can have me as a friend, Facebook, Kevin Linux, Spreaker.com, KVOLE, if you're listening on the audio portion of this, SoundCloud, YouTube, you can also subscribe on iTunes. Trevor, really appreciate this. I know that Jason has said that he would be willing to have a conversation with someone that has concern. If you're open to that, I would love to get you, Jason, to have another dialogue at some point in time. Maybe not tonight, obviously, but in a future time. Maybe I think a good time is when we know when provincial government announces what they're going to kick in. That might be a good way to bring that back. But
yeah, I'd be happy to, and then that's a natural time, because that would be the fine piece of important details. I should also say the big corporation is also committed to releasing at an unspecified date in the future more information around the economic impact studies that they've done. So there would be more meat on the bones once they do that as well.
Cool. Yes. All right. Thank everyone for listening. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Trevor, for being on. late